Hello, welcome to the Pinocchio Project. I'm Mitch Friedman, and this is a new season for us. It's season 3, but it's also a new season of our production. As you can see me. And if you've been consuming the podcast in seasons 1 and 2, and we've never met before, you may have been wondering, I wonder what this guy looks like. So here I am, and now it's confirmed that I do have a face made for radio. But nevertheless, we wanted to launch into this new season with video available as well. We'll have a Pinocchio Project channel on YouTube that's being set up. So that's something I want to let you know right out of the gate is this is our launch for audio and video, and we will be improving the production quality for the video portion as we move along. The audio portion, as always, will also be available on your podcast platforms, Spotify, iTunes, etc. So you can look for the audio portion there as well. But we're excited about being here in this new season of production and presentation. And I want to say thanks to my engineer back there, Tom Strickfadden. He is the one who has masterminded this video production, and he has a long pedigree of great experience and training and credentials in preparing and producing video presentations. So thank you, Tom. So if you are new to the Pinocchio Project, welcome. And our mission here on the project is to examine everyday ideas that promise human flourishing, and we all want to flourish. There are a lot of promises out there and ideas on what it means to flourish. We examine these ideas from a biblical perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, to test their reliability and to prove whether or not they can reliably deliver on their promises. So, succinctly, the Pinocchio Project exists to examine everyday ideas that promise human flourishing, to determine whether or not they can deliver on their promises. And once again, this season 3 will be video and audio, and we're pumped to be able to launch this new endeavor. Today, as we launch season 3, we're in the new year, so I want to wish you a happy new year. I hope you had a somewhat restful Christmas experience. Ours was fairly chaotic, as we're kind of used to, with travel and kiddos and grandkiddos and surrounding friends. And it was mostly a great time, a little bit exhausting. I got a little bit of rest the week between Christmas and New Year's. But I want to say Happy New Year to you. And, you know, we all make sort of, well, maybe we all don't. Maybe we've given up on resolutions or promises to ourselves or goals for the new year. Goal setting is great. A lot of times our resolutions are things that are fairly, I think, physically attuned, like I'm going to lose some weight, I'm going to get in shape, I'm going to get my finances in order, I'm going to get my relationships in order. Those are all good things. But I want to go a little bit deeper, really, for several podcasts here. And that's one thing I forgot to mention. We'll be moving from a twice-a-week drop of the podcast and the YouTube presentation. Now we're just going to be doing once a week, and we'll try to just drop every Monday. But we're going from twice a week, which was a presentation from typically between about 15 and 22 minutes, to a once a week presentation, a little bit longer form, I'd say between 30 and 35 minutes. So that's something to keep in mind. If you're looking for us, as you've been consuming the podcast, if you're looking for us on Monday and Friday, we're going to have a longer form presentation on Monday only. And I'd love to get your feedback. We'll have some links for you to provide feedback. Love to hear from you all the time on how this new format is working. But what I want to do for these first several podcasts is launch us into the new year with maybe a little more depth of understanding of what an idea of successful, flourishing living would look like from a biblical perspective. And so as we reset the new year, I just have this wish. I'm wishing you and me a virtuous new year. So a virtuous new year to you. And so that may be something you haven't heard before. Virtuous obviously is a derivative of the word virtue. And virtue, I think, is a word that maybe is not heard or understood or explained very much in our cultural moment over the past couple of decades. I would offer that virtue, from its classical understanding, is disappearing from our behavioral landscape as we insist on more and more autonomy. And that's something you've heard me talk about many times if you consume the podcast on a regular basis, is that we are moving into a season of cultural freedom, quote unquote, and it could be argued whether or not it's freedom or slavery. So I would offer that we are, in our cultural moment, less and less interested in what classical virtue would look like and more interested in personal autonomy, where I have the, quote, freedom to behave any way I feel, and you have to affirm my behavior and my understanding of who I say I am. Virtue is kind of on the opposite end of that spectrum. Virtue is the thing that insists I behave in certain ways for my benefit and my flourishing, but also for the benefit and the flourishing of the people in my life. And it's sort of, virtue is a common glue around which we can all gather and feel like we're safe and feel like that we are affirmed in a way that is community oriented and good for the whole, rather than what's good for the flourishing, quote unquote, of the individual. So virtue, I would say, is diminishing while a demand for autonomy is increasing. And so I want to talk for several podcasts about virtue. And I guess the first thing I need to do is define it. Just to summarize, as we move forward into this definition, I think our culture is moving towards a virtue-less expression of what it means to do life well, individually and collectively. We're virtually virtueless, if you will, virtually virtueless. So let me define virtue. Virtue simply is behavior that shows high moral standards. Behavior that exhibits high moral standards. So if you're training yourself in worldview, the thing that should come to mind almost immediately is, if there is a moral standard, who is it or what is it that sets the standard? So if I'm behaving to a standard, that means that someone or something has provided that bar of expectation for my morality and my behavior. And so the question a biblical worldview has to ask and answer well is, who sets the standard? And the understanding from a biblical perspective is that God, the ultimate transcendent authority, the objective truth, he has set the standard for my behavior. He is the one who defines morality. It's not something that I decide internally based on, again, my feelings and my need for autonomy. I am bound to, for my own good, from a biblical perspective, we have to understand this well. For my own good and flourishing, and for the flourishing of those around me, I am bound to what God says appropriate moral behavior would look like. So virtue is behavior that expresses the high moral standard that God has provided for me, for my own good. He's my creator. He understands how I'm made. He understands what I'm for. And he understands that when I behave in ways that are appropriate to his standards, I experience flourishing, and so do the people around me. And so what I'd like to do is, I'm just going to cover today one virtue of 7. Now, there has been lots of discussion throughout the centuries about what an understandable and appropriate set of virtues are for someone who lives in communion with their culture in order to bring about the best possible outcomes. And there have been scholars across all denominations and traditions from a Christian perspective trying to decide on what a common set of virtues are, drawn from a biblical perspective, rooted in the biblical text. And that's really the only place we want to live here on the Pinocchio Project. We want to have opinions that can be defended powerfully and appropriately and accurately in the biblical text. And those are the only opinions we want, because we come to understand that when my view of the world and my life and my place in it is shaped by the biblical text, that gives me the best possible flourishing outcomes. So I've decided on 7 what I would call classical or traditional or orthodox virtues, and I've used a variety of sources. You can find them for yourselves in other places and see what all kind of scholars and godly men and women over the centuries have decided on. But I've decided to use 7 as I'm wishing us a virtuous new year. And these virtues are going to encourage you, and they're going to challenge you about your own ideas of what it means to live well and behave well. Because bad ideas about flourishing don't only come at us from the exterior, they are actually produced on the interior as well. We understand as Christians that we are still living in this tent of flesh, meaning that I'm prone to say yes to my sin nature, my flesh, and as we've talked about many times on the Pinocchio Project, the characteristics of my sin nature are: I want to promote myself, I want to protect myself from blame, I want to indulge my appetites outside the guardrails of moral behavior, and I want to insist that my agenda succeeds over everybody else's. So these virtues come against my flesh's default behaviors and inclinations, and therefore challenge me to reconsider the ideas that I have about my own flourishing. So the first, and this is all we'll do for today, the first virtue I want to discuss is humility, the first of 7. Humility. And I would offer, you could use this as, I would say, the baseline or the foundation point from which all the other virtues must rest, upon which all the other virtues must rest. Humility. And there's a lot of definitions of humility. From a typical definition in the biblical sense, humility is defined as that by which a person has a modest estimate of his or her own worth. And modest here means sort of submitted, a recessed view of self, one that has not too high an opinion of themselves, as in Romans 12. Humility is the higher and ethical sense by which a person has a modest estimate of his or her own worth and submits themselves to others. C.S. Lewis said it this way, one of my favorite authors, and maybe yours too. C.S. Lewis said, humility doesn't mean that someone thinks less of themselves, but they think of themselves less. And, you can wrestle with that on your own. But basically, it's not an abasement. It's not a degrading of self in the way you think of yourself. It is I don't really think about myself at all. I'm looking out for the interest of others. And that would be what I would offer as a Philippians 2 sort of recognition of humility. So again, if God sets the standard for our ethical, moral behavior, and we are bound to that behavior for our own good and the good of others, then we understand these virtues are the practical ways that the ethics and the morals play themselves out. So humility is the first one. And I saw this example here recently of humility in the wrong direction, which I would offer is just a lack of humility. Which I'm prone to too. Every time I'm pointing a finger outward, there's 3 that can be pointed, unless I can use my thumb. Let's see, does that work? Yeah, there's at least 3 that point back at me. But in the headlines over the recent days has been a representative from the state of New York representing Long Island. His name is George Santos. And I don't know if you keep up with things in the political news. I have to because I like to frame content for the Pinocchio Project based on how Americans, in particular, willingly put people in office that may or may not have the most virtuous fabric by which they conduct themselves. But Mr. Santos, I'm reading here from the New York Times on December 29th of last year, which was just about a week ago. Mr. Santos, a Republican representative-elect from Long Island, fabricated key biographical elements of his background, including misrepresentations of his professional background, educational history, and property ownership in a pattern of deception that was uncovered by the New York Times. He even misrepresented his Jewish heritage. Now, this is interesting to me because I am a Jew. I can't misrepresent my Jewish heritage. I am Jewish. And when I looked into this particular charge of misrepresentation closer, what Mr. Santos said to defend himself was, I didn't say I was Jewish. I said I was Jew-ish, like Mitch would say, he's old-ish. And so you may think that this needs to be massaged a bit in order to fit into a lack of humility. I would say that it actually represents clearly a lack of humility. Anytime a human being, anytime I am tempted to misrepresent myself to others, I am clearly wanting to elevate myself in their eyes in order to be seen as someone higher or better or more qualified than I actually am. So these kinds of deceptions indicate and portray a lack of humility, which I would, in a way, if I was to be as a political candidate, I would think that I wanted to be as upfront and transparent as possible, knowing that in this age of media scrutiny, whether or not I was doing it from a lack of integrity or forgetfulness, if I was to misrepresent myself, it would be caught immediately. And that would be a motivation for me to represent myself well. At the baseline, if I'm a follower of Jesus Christ, the only motivation I need is to be someone that can lay themselves open to be evaluated plainly and clearly without having to, again, ensure my agenda succeeds by misrepresenting myself or promoting myself by telling lies or creating deceptions. And so Mr. Santos, in the very present day, is a stark example of someone who is virtually virtueless in the area of humility. But again, before I cast stones at Mr. Santos, I need to check my own heart and my own propensities to elevate myself in the eyes of others. And that might be a good consideration for you out there consuming the Pinocchio Project as well. How would you say you're doing in the area of this moral behavior of laying yourself open, not needing to elevate yourself, not needing to promote yourself, not needing to insist through means of deception or otherwise immoral ways that your agenda succeeds? The New York Times also has let us know that unfortunately, when it comes to political candidates misrepresenting themselves by padding their resumes, Mr. Santos is in good company. And this might be interesting to you because it has very contemporary presidential implications. So our current president, Joe Biden, in his failed run for the presidency in the 1988 election, was busted in the year before in 1987 for grossly misrepresenting himself. And when he was caught, he actually went on the defensive and tried to deny it and got really angry with people who were honestly confronting him with his misrepresentations. And you can research it on your own. You can just search Joe Biden's misrepresentations in 1987. And this was something I was unaware of. I mean, I'm old enough to have lived through that cycle. I was in my early 30s in 1987, and I don't really remember much of this at all as far as Joe Biden's run for the presidency. But he out lied about many, many things regarding his own academic prowess, his own performance in law school, his own statements of deception, that he won several moot court competitions in law school, and that he received full scholarship on academics. And what was discovered was Mr. Biden had actually plagiarized some content and some credentials from a candidate over in England many years before. And it's just a twisted web, really. But unfortunately, this propensity to set aside humility and self-honesty and authenticity in order to elevate ourselves is something that is unfortunately much too common in our political arena. And I think that says something to us, and it should warn us about how we vet the people we vote for. And we've said this before on the Pinocchio Project. We're not necessarily party-oriented to the core. We are values-oriented. And those values must include express virtues in order to be confident that the people we're putting in office represent a biblical framework as much as possible when it comes to making policy that promotes human flourishing. And so I don't know how long this has gone. I sense it might be a little bit short today, but that's fine. I wanted to introduce the video format and take us through this what I would call happy, virtuous New Year to you, and give you an opportunity to examine for yourself as we move through these virtues in the coming weeks, what it looks like for you to be able to identify ideas that lack virtue and to be able to look internally at ideas you may be continually behaving in that need to be adjusted in order to live a life that's pleasing to the one who has given us a transcendent set, a universal set, a changeless set of values and virtues, so that we may experience flourishing in the best possible outcomes, not only for ourselves, but communicate those in the relationships that we have. So, for the Pinocchio Project, this is Mitch Friedman, signing off.